exciting and inspiring activity that is in conversation with Dr. Naushad Forbes, the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall. Today's conversation is the seventh in a series of conversations starting with the interaction with the Honorable Minister Dr. Harshvardhan and several other top leaders. As part of Track 1 of STIP 2020, when people of all ages and of all regions of India and literally every citizen took part in this activity, which was the consultation with experts and the public. Today, as part of this conversation, you are all invited to put your thoughts and ideas and ask your queries on all our social media platforms using the hashtag #ChatWithNaushadForbes. That being said, I hand over the session to my co-moderator, Dr. Ipsita Roy, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, National Institute of Technology, Rourkela. Over to you, Ipsita.
Thank you, Janice, very much for this invitation. And first of all, the entire group of the STIP 2020 for actually inviting me here to moderate the session. This is my first session of this kind, and I'm really excited to be a part of this, and also, of course, with the esteemed guests that we have today. So I just want to welcome Dr. Naushad Forbes and just want to wish you to have a wonderful session. Just for people who are not aware of Dr. Naushad Forbes, and I'm pretty sure that that number of people are not too many. He is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. He was the president of the CII, the Confederation of Indian Industry, in 2016-17, and is currently the chairman and also the founder of the CTIER in Pune, the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research. He, throughout his academic and professional career, he has been associated with the Stanford University. He was a guest faculty, visiting faculty there. And he's also is on the board of several academic institutions and public companies in India and abroad. He has also supported the establishment of the Forbes Marshall Energy Efficiency Center at IIT Bombay in 2016. And lastly, I would want to mention for people who are interested to learn about his academic work, he has written extensively on innovation in developing countries and higher education in India, and including a book From Followers to Leaders, Managing Technology and Innovation. So I really welcome Dr. Naushad Forbes, and I hand over this address now. You can proceed with your address, and then we can go on with our question answer sessions and then the live comments. So over to you.
Thank you, Ipsita, and thank you, Jens, and everyone for putting this program together. I'm delighted to be with you this evening. So let me start just by saying good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be with you for a few different reasons, and I'll come to the most important reason at the end of some of these introductory comments. What I wanted to do in a very brief period, because I think the thought was that I'll speak for just a few minutes, and then we open it up to a conversation that we have and where we can address questions that you have in your heads. And so we leave most of the time for that. So let me make one background comment on the role of technology, science, innovation in national development, and then make some comments specifically about some data on India, which I think is where I'm coming from and which tells me where our great opportunities lie. So let me start with the background comment first. Technology, science, innovation has played a critical role in national development around the world now for over 250 years, essentially since the first industrial revolution through to the present. In this long period of time, in these 250 years, no country has grown rapidly, no country has become rich, no country has become a developed country without innovation being at the heart of the development process and its own growth processes over long periods of time, over decades. And innovation has actually contributed in most of these countries, in most countries, to over half of total growth, total let's say, productivity growth or per capita GDP growth. There are a few other contributions too, which we can talk about if people are interested in this later on. But innovation has been the dominant contributor to long-run GDP growth, and it will continue to be that way for the foreseeable future. The same is true in our own growth experience. The same is true in China's current growth experience. The same was true in the US's growth experience over the last 200 years. The same was true of the UK's growth experience in the 19th century. The same was true of Japan's growth experience or the East Asian tiger's growth experience. Any extended, strong growth experience has innovation at its core and at its heart. Now, what if you come to India and look at how things are and have been over the last 30 years? One thing has changed very dramatically since 1991, and two things, I would argue, have not changed that dramatically, and that's where the opportunity lies. What's changed dramatically is product and service markets. In 1991, we operated in an environment where things were very different. We take for granted these days that what we have available to us in the country is on a par with what's available around the world and the best that's available around the world. Whether that's a product like a car, or it's foodstuffs, or it's the kind of services that we can tap into, it's our telecom or whatever. We take for granted that all of these are today on a par with what's available worldwide. It wasn't that way in 1991, and we should not forget that fact. In 1991, we were a decade or more behind the rest of the world in the quality and efficiency with which products got made and the availability of products for all of us as citizens. So that's been transformed, our product and service markets, in these 30 years. What's not changed? Now, one of the things that we keep talking about is manufacturing as a share of GDP. Manufacturing as a share of GDP was around 15% in 1991. It's around 15% today. And it stayed at around 15% for this entire period. In some years it goes up to about 17%, and then it comes back down to 14, 15%. So manufacturing as a share of GDP has not changed in this period of time. That doesn't mean it hasn't grown, but it's grown at the same pace as GDP has grown, and therefore the share of manufacturing in GDP has not changed, even though we've had in this government and in the previous government a specific objective of raising the share of manufacturing to 25%. Now, let me combine that with the second thing that hasn't changed that dramatically. It's changed a little, but not that much. If you look at the broad innovation metrics, if you look at investment in R&D particularly, that hasn't changed that dramatically either. Total R&D, if you look at total R&D investments as a country, in 1991, we were at around 0.7% of GDP, total investments in R&D nationally. We're at about 0.7% today. And in this entire 30-year period, you see that rate go from 0.7, occasionally it went up to as much as 0.9, but it's by and large stayed around 0.7, 0.8% of GDP over this entire 30-year period. Unlike, for example, China, where you see China starting actually below us in 1991, and you see China today invests, as a percentage of GDP, it invests about 3 times as much in R&D, about 2.1, 2.2%. And if you look at China's economy being 5 times our size, that says that China today, total national investments in R&D are about 15 times ours. So there's a huge gap between what we do and what's possible to do and what the rest of the world does. Let me make a few comments about how we are an outlier in our total R&D investments. Total investment in in-house R&D by Indian industry is around 0.3% of GDP, 0.3, 0.35% of GDP. The world average, and also the average in China, but the world average is 1.5% of GDP. In other words, for our firms to match the world average of in-house R&D investments, we need to scale our investment in in-house R&D by a factor of 5 to go from 0.3 to 1.5% of GDP. If you take public research done in the higher education system, total public research done in the higher education system in our country is 0.04% of GDP. The world average is 0.4% of GDP. So to match the world average again, we need to scale total public research done in our higher education system by a factor of 10. So these are huge multiples. And the reason I'm mentioning them is because any effort to put together an effective science, technology, innovation policy has to deal very directly with the how of how we're going to deliver this. How are we going to deliver a scaling up of 5 times in in-house R&D investments by private industry and a scaling up of 10 times in public research done in the higher education system? Let me make one last comment, and then I'll stop, and then we can get into much more discussion. The last comment is that one of the essential things that we need to do is for science, for discussion around these kinds of issues to be up front and center in our public discourse. It is in many, many countries, but it's not been in ours. It's not been the case in India. Generally discussion on R&D policy, technology policy, innovation policy, this tends to be seen as something that is best left to a few specialists here and there. It needs to become a front and center policy issue in our country. It is a front and center policy issue in most developed markets. It's a front and center policy issue through many Asian economies. If you go to a Singapore, it's one of the key things that the Singapore government worries about. If you go to a Japan, it's what they worry about. If you go to a China, it's what they worry about. We need to as well. That was the prompt for us setting up in Pune some years ago, the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research that was referred to earlier on STIR. And the goal of STIR is to raise the profile of these issues, of the role of science, technology, and innovation in national development, to raise that in the discussion, in the public profile, in the public policy arena. And that's why I think this initiative is so wonderful, because this is the way in which we will get there. It's by having conversations like this that we can actually engage more people in these kinds of issues. It's the way in which we can get people to start thinking about how this affects what they do in their own firms, and about how innovation can play a bigger role in our own national development efforts. Let me stop there and turn it over to you now, Ipsita, and let's get into conversation mode, and let me talk about things that you're interested in and what everyone else is interested in. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Naushad, for this very nice introduction to what the general tone of today's conversation will be on. You have rightly pointed out many of the issues that we currently face. I have been just starting to work in innovation areas, and I have personally worked with in 3 years. 3 years time I have worked on innovation areas. I will mainly, so therefore my questions to you will be based on what I have generally seen over time, what has been the pattern with innovation studies, innovation research, and generally your understanding of what can be done. My first question to you, therefore, would be that you have worked extensively on R&D. So your work on with Stanford and all these kind of works that you have done, you have talked about R&D in the private sector, and you yourself in the talk have mentioned about R&D being pretty much stagnating in the past 30 years or 40 years or so. My question to you is, the first part is what needs to be done. So we talk about tax policies, we talk about various ways of improving research and development, incentivizing people to innovate more, to undertake research and development more, then the question becomes, are we able to achieve that, that 2% in 2020's time? What needs to be done in order to reach that stage in 2022, even 2025? Is it more of a incentive point of view, or is it because we do not have that kind of innovation culture, that sufficient innovation culture in India? So just want to understand from you what needs to be incentivized. Is it our R&D workforce? Is it policies, tax policies? What exactly needs to be balanced?
So, there's been a lot of work done on the role of, for example, tax incentives in fostering investments in R&D and in innovation. And most of the work shows that they help, but they help. They don't determine. Yeah,
Right.
They can support, but they don't determine the outcome. At the end of the day, what does determine the outcome is the choices that firms make for wanting to be innovative. So let me try and address that by talking about our own firm. In 1991, we had an R&D department. It was a small department, and our R&D efforts could be summed up in one word: indigenization. If something was imported, a component was imported, develop it, make it locally. That was the sum total of what we did by and large in our R&D efforts. So let's say July 1991 is when Manmohan Singh, as the finance minister, presented his budget. And that budget speech, by the way, I think is one of the great speeches in history anywhere in the world. And everyone should hear it because it's a wonderful speech. And it has relevance even today. And that budget speech talked about how it was time for India to integrate with the world, how Indian industry needed to integrate with the world, that foreign competition should be allowed into India, and Indian companies needed to see the world as their market. And when my brother Farad and I heard that speech, within a couple of weeks, we had a series of meetings with our entire leadership team. And we went through our whole product portfolio. And we asked a very simple question. We said, if this product can be imported free of duty, with zero duty, will we still make it? Will we still be competitive? And we concluded that about half our product portfolio at that time, maybe over half, we were not going to be competitive in. And so we needed to let it die and go away over time. But we then decided that we would do two things. We decided first that we would invest in R&D to a much greater extent, and the word indigenization would be banned. So we decided that we would increase our total R&D team by a factor of 4. So we would have 4 times as many R&D engineers. And they would only work on products that we could sell worldwide. So not products for the Indian market. If we could sell them in India, great, but products for the world market. And it took us 3 or 4 years to figure out how to do that. I mean, it took us 3 or 4 years before we started seeing the first products coming out the door. But they started coming out in 3-4 years. By 6-7 years out, there was a regular flow of products. And that's become the heart of our development effort and our company success over these decades. The second thing we resolved was that we would invest in international. So we said, the best way of competing with foreign firms in India is if we know we can compete with them outside of India. If we can compete with them outside of India, we'll be able to compete with them easily in India. So we said, we went international in 1991 for that reason alone. We didn't go international because of the international market. We went international because we wanted to teach ourselves how to compete effectively, and it worked. Today, we see the international market as a very attractive market for us as a company. But at that time, it was done purely as a disciplining tool and as a choice that we made. And I think it comes down to that. I think it's the choice that firms make. If firms choose to be innovative and to invest in R&D, we're not alone as a company. There are many, many hundreds of good Indian companies that have done just this. And I think those are the efforts that one needs to then reward. One last comment on the role of tax incentives. about how many years back? Maybe about 12 years back, maybe. Um, 12, 14 years back, there was a tax incentive brought in for investments by general industry in R&D. And the incentive was that you got a 200% weighted deduction on all R&D expenses. When that came in, we calculated what the effect was. And we said that, okay, it means that we can actually grow our R&D strength by another third. And if we grow our R&D strength by another third, then we will essentially the tax incentive will pay for that extra investment in R&D. And so that's what we did. And it took us a year or two to actually get that many more R&D engineers, etc. Good people on the ground working on projects. And today, even though the tax incentive has gone away, those R&D investments still make total sense. All the R&D investments are continuing, and we continue to grow our strength and our commitments to R&D. Because today, we see R&D as the source of us surviving as a company and thriving as a company in the long run. So I think that's what determines investments in R&D. It's companies seeing that if they don't invest in R&D, they will disappear. They will be pushed out of business. It's the threat that really makes companies invest in R&D. And tax incentives can help, as I said, but they won't determine.
Okay, so that's very good to know, because generally when we hear about these kind of discussions, it's always relates to the quantitative aspects of policy, what needs to be done. So I think it also has to do with self-motivation and just the culture, the innovation culture, research. Yes.
Can I give you one more data
Sure.
point? If you
Yes.
take so now I hope this provokes someone hearing this. If you take the Indian software industry, it's a software services industry. The total R&D investments by our software services industry is a little less than 1% of turnover. Yeah. If you take the top 10 Indian software service firms, if you take the top 10 Chinese software firms, and the great bulk of them are also actually service firms, total investments in R&D by the top 10 Chinese software firms is 8% of R&D. Now, why is that? Indian software firms are more profitable with profits as a percentage of sales than the Chinese firms. Our Indian software firms are large firms by international standards. So why do we invest so little in R&D? And if you actually go around and ask the question, and you ask the firms the question, I'm not sure the firms think they invest that little in R&D. So I think, part of it is having these kinds of conversations and provoking someone and getting someone to go off and do a good benchmarking exercise and say, so if I'm investing 1%, maybe I need to say, okay, next year I'm going to make it 2, and the year after that I'm going to make it 3, and how am I going to grow this? And then you start saying, now, okay, if I'm growing my R&D investments, how do I make sure that they're productive?
Okay, so good point. I mean, we can check on our social media later on when we open the questions for the floor. You mentioned services, and you have mentioned certain areas of manufacturing which are investing, particularly with respect to aerospace, pharmaceuticals, biotech. We have done a significant amount of indigenous innovation, what we would call, but the major chunk of research and development innovation has come from that aspect, or have come from that manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing. The MSME sector, and that is also one of the major concern of policies, current government policies, is that the MSME sector is not contributing at all to research and development. We are talking about Atmanirbhar, and we are talking about achieving self-reliance and so on. First of all, do you think going that kind of a strategy or following that kind of a path would be beneficial in the long run? And secondly, if so, what would be a good way to incentivize those kind of indigenous innovation, especially for the MSME sectors?
So there are actually three questions in what you asked. There's a question around sectors and
Yes.
sectors that matter
Excuse me.
to especially investments in innovation and R&D.
Yes.
There's the question around MSMEs and what's right for MSMEs. And there's the question around self-reliance and the Atmanirbhar program. Yeah. And I'd like to deal with each of them separately because I think they're separate things, even though they come together in some way.
Yes.
First of all, in terms of sectors, R&D worldwide in industry is a very concentrated thing. If you take the top, if you take out of hundreds of sectors, if you take 10 selected sectors, it accounts for, I think the number is, it accounts for around 80% of all in-house in all industrial R&D investments. Out of those 10 sectors, if you take the top three sectors, it accounts for over half of all industrial investments in R&D. So if you're not present in those 3 or 10 sectors in an effective way, you're going to lag. Yeah. Now, what are those sectors? I can't rattle off all 10, but I can certainly mention a few. So pharmaceuticals is number one, where we have a good, strong R&D presence. Second is technology hardware, where we have zero presence. In the top 2,500 R&D spenders worldwide, we have zero firms in technology hardware. Right? Third is automobiles and auto components. We have a decent presence. Right? You keep going down through that list. Right? In 5 out of the 10 sectors, we have no firms in the top 2,500. So if we want to play a bigger part in world innovation, then we need to have a presence in the bulk of those. We're a huge country. We need to have a presence in those 10 sectors. And there's some obvious ones missing. You mentioned aerospace. Aerospace is one of the sectors. But in aerospace, we have zero firms out of the top 2,500. And our actual investments in R&D are negligible compared to what many around the world do. So there are many areas like that, which are opportunities for us if we choose to take them and choose to develop those sectors in the right way. And if you'd like, we can get into how a little later on. The second piece with regard to MSMEs. So again, it depends on the sector. If you have successful MSMEs in, for example, the textile and garment sector or footwear, you don't actually need to invest in R&D. It's a sector that can grow and thrive with some investments in design, but almost nothing in R&D, right? But if you want to be a successful player in the auto industry, then an auto component industry and value-added auto components, you better invest in R&D. If you want to be a successful player in pharmaceuticals, you better invest in R&D. In engineering, you better invest in R&D. So it depends on where your MSME sector is actually concentrated. And if they're in the sectors that require significant R&D investments, then we should be expecting a lot to happen there. I think the issue for us is that our MSME sectors tend to be in clusters. Our MSME firms tend to be in clusters. These clusters tend to be in more traditional sectors and more traditional manufacturing. And it's only when you start fostering and creating MSMEs in sectors that are more R&D intensive that we should expect them to then be more R&D intensive. Yeah. So I think, saying that, well, I know I worry sometimes that we want to do everything. We want to see really innovative medium-sized firms. The first thing is, well, we should have really successful medium-sized firms. And if we have really successful medium-sized firms in certain sectors without R&D, that's fine. And in certain sectors, for them to be successful, they have to do R&D, and they're the ones that should be incentivized to do it. The last one is on self-reliance. Self-reliance, I have lots of problems with. If by self-reliance you mean resilience and a resilient supply chain, I'm all for it. Especially during a pandemic, during a huge public health crisis, you don't have local, good, reliable supplies of masks and PPEs, you need those supply chains in place. I'm all for that. But if by self-reliance, we mean that we should be making everything in our country, I think that's a mistake. It's what we tried in the 70s. It didn't work then, and it won't work now. And what would be the absolute worst thing to do is if we try to extend the self-reliance approach to technology. We tried that. We tried that from the late 60s through to the early 80s. We tried that. We had restrictions on the import of technology by firms. And it was a policy that ended up pushing Indian industry 15 years behind the world. And it was a stupid policy then, and it's not a sensible policy today.
Okay, so I think that this answer would trigger some questions later on. I think it's a very good. I think for discussion and debate, I think it's a very good thing to learn, because I mean you have been in this particular sector for a long time now. So I think experience speaks. So let's see what we can have in our social media section later on. The next question would be related to industry academia linkages. Now, so far we have talked mainly about industrial R&D and so on. You have been associated with not only with academic institutions, but you have also been associated with industrial collaborations and so on. Industry here, as you have mentioned, that it's an outlier. I mean, R&D is done by certain in-house industries or by some specific public labs. With this kind of a structure in mind, with your experience, just what do you think would be a better strategy to strengthen this academia industrial linkages? And we have been actually talking about these PPP models and industrial academia linkages for a very long time now. In your experience and in general, what you have seen, so just some inputs on that would be helpful to have a general perspective.
Sure. So, in my initial comments, I made the comparison between total public research done in our higher education system at 0.04% of GDP versus a world average of 0.4%. I said, we need to scale that by a factor of 10.
Yes.
Now, how do we scale by a factor of 10? What will it take? What's keeping it from happening? What's not keeping it from happening is the government investing enough in public research. Actually, in India, investment by the state, by the government in public research is equal to the share done worldwide. So if you look around the world, typically around 0.5%, 0.5, 0.6% of GDP is invested by the state in research. In India, it's 0.4%. It's not very different, right? Why is it then that we invest so little in higher education? It's because of a choice that we made many decades ago, which was to locate most of the public research that we funded in autonomous R&D labs, in the CSR system, in the DRDO system, in the ICAR system, in a whole bunch of autonomous R&D labs, instead of locating this research in the higher education system. The rest of the world, by and large, does most of its public research in the higher education system. We do most of our research. Over 85% of our public research is done in autonomous R&D labs. Less than 15% of our total publicly funded research is done within the higher education system. It's very easy to correct this, right? Why do we need to do it in the higher education system? Because two things happen. Research benefits, because you have lots of young minds working on these research problems. But much more than that, higher education benefits. And you end up producing a much better caliber of talent, because you have people coming out from our higher education institutions who are working together with professors who are doing research on a day-to-day basis. And this talent learns how to do research by working as an apprentice to the professor and accompanying them and learning by working together with them. And when they come out into the job market, they can go into research knowing how to do research. Yeah? So the single big effect of locating research within higher education is the production of talent. It's not naturally production of research. And that's what we should be trying to achieve. It's what the rest of the world has done for years and years and years. This is an issue we have not started to address. It's actually quite feasible to do it. We spend total public research spending each year is around 80,000 crores. It's not a small number, 80,000 crores. Total public research spending done within the higher education sector is, as far as I know, around 10,000 crores, right? It's grown in recent years, but it's around 10,000 crores, right? What we would recommend, we had recommended this from CII as well. We said that, look, take the total increase that you normally get just from inflation each year in the public labs. So you get about 8,000 crores of extra funding each year, which is provided for in the budget. And that goes in because just to keep the spending in the national lab system at the same level in real terms. Yeah? And what we recommended is, look, keep it the same in nominal terms and take the total amount of increase and provide it as a fund available for higher education institutions to draw on. And let it be only public higher education institutions to begin with, and later on open it up to private ones too. But start with the public ones at least. You do that, and in 1 year, you can double the amount almost going into public research being done in the higher education system. In another year, you can make it 3 times, and another year after that, 4 times. I mean, in a very short period of time, you can bridge the gap with the world, and you can actually end up with a higher education system that is research intensive and a higher education system that produces talent that is available to, whether it's industry, whether it's labs, whether it's a public health effort, whatever it might be, that is available to really be your innovative resource. A last comment around this. You know, one of the most research intensive and successful education facilities in the country was what used to be called UDCT. It used to be the University Department of Chemical Technology at Bombay University. And it was set up by some really great faculty. It was run for many years by a Professor M.M. Sharma, who is a wonderful person and did a fabulous job of really educating wonderful students. And they did a lot of very good research. But you know, if they had no research output, UDCT, which is now, I think it's now the Institute of Chemical Technology or something like that, the UDCT would still have made a massive contribution to the country. Because you know who the graduates of UDCT are? Mukesh Ambani, Madhukar Parekh of Pidilite, Ramesh Mashelkar, Keki Garda of Garda Chemicals, Anji Reddy of DRL, Darbari Seth of Tata Chemicals. These are the graduates from UDCT. And so the role that graduates and talent plays in taking the country forward is much greater than the research that comes out from these institutes. And that's what we should be trying to do. We should be trying to create this regular ongoing flow of wonderful, high quality talent, but where we have half a dozen stars who I mentioned, we should have hundreds.
Okay. I just have one question because time is running out. So, I mean, I have many questions, but I think I'll just stick to one last question on data. You started the whole discussion, the mentioning the data issue. Data on research and development, data on innovation, that has been significantly lacking here. I have personally worked with the German, the Community Innovation Surveys, and generally the European Community Innovation Surveys. And I do know that those kind of data exists, and they are very much helpful in not only understanding the R&D, what R&D is, what innovation is, but also generally evaluating firms and so on and so forth, industries. Data is a huge issue in India, and we have discussed this problem of data multiple times. It's not a new thing that we are mentioning data, not only in compiling data, but also in the monitoring, evaluation, and then setting up a kind of a structured innovation survey or R&D survey and so on. What is your take on this data issue, and what do you think can be done as a first immediate step to achieve or to at least overcome the problem with data with regard to R&D and innovation?
So first of all, I hear your pain and I agree with you. And it's true
Yes.
of everyone who works in this area in the country. I think anyone who works in the innovation space in the country wrestles with the lack of high quality and up-to-date data. Yeah. So give you a small example of something that a question that I've often asked. If you simply ask the question, who are the top 100 R&D spenders in India? Yeah. Most countries, it's a straightforward question. You can actually get it off a government website and you'll get the list of firms. For us, you'll wrestle with that answer. Because there are some firms that have R&D facilities approved by the DST, and that'll be one list, and that won't include the IT services firms. That's another list, and that list will not include the firms that are doing contract research. That's yet another list, and that may not include the in-house R&D facilities like a Jack Welch laboratory of GE in Bangalore or something. That won't be included either. So, you'd have to, it's a significant data coordination job. So actually, one of the things that we've been doing in STIR is putting together data and making it available to anyone working in this area, because we figure that the best way in which we can help the whole ecosystem is if we provide this data so that researchers around the country working in this area don't feel, number one, so lonely, and number two, have access to decent, up-to-date data. Now, some of it involves, looking at company accounts, digging out the numbers from the company accounts, making sure that the same name applies across different years, and actually creating and putting those data sets together. I hear you, it's a problem. It's something that we need to address as a country, because we need up-to-date, good quality data for us to know whether we're progressing and how we're progressing.
Right.
Yeah. Otherwise we're wandering around in the dark.
Okay. Just let me, Janice, should we move on to the live session then?
Yes, Ipsita. I think it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you, Dr. Naushad. The kind of areas that you touched with regard to this broad topic on innovation, particularly focusing on locating research within higher education